Where is the next major war? 70% think Taiwan. 30% think the Persian Gulf or the Middle East. Who better then to speak to next but the one and only Professor Seyed Marandi, Professor of English Literature and Orientalism at the University of Tehran, and quite the best advocate of events in Iran and around the world from Tehran that I have ever seen or heard, and I'm very glad to say he's back with us now. Professor, let's start with that question we're asking. Overwhelmingly, people think there might be a war in China, with China, over Taiwan, in the Straits, in the South China Sea. But 30% of people think that the next big war will be in the Persian Gulf or the Middle East. I must say I lean towards that point of view myself. What would you say to our poll?
Well, it's sort of like fire and ice. I really don't know. Hopefully it will be neither. But I think the chances for war in both regions is pretty high. In the case of Taiwan, the United States is taking a position from which it can't back down. And Taiwan is a Chinese province, and the Chinese are not going to back down. So it seems that some sort of conflict is going to be inevitable unless the Americans back down at some point. Or in Taiwan, there is some sort of major political upheaval and the opposition gains power by a huge majority or through some other means and forces the Americans to back down. In our region, while there is a lot of good news coming from the Persian Gulf region, the rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia and Yemen, Saudi Arabia and Syria, the Emirates in Syria, Kuwait in Syria, all of that is good news. And maybe the Turks will be able to come to terms with the Syrians and withdraw. We'll have to wait and see. But I think the government in the Israeli government, the Israeli regime right now, is pushing the country towards war, and the faction in power now is I compare the liberals in Israel and the current extreme right wing government. I compare them to Al-Qaeda, and ISIS. And ISIS is tougher than Al-Qaeda. If there's a battle between the two, and whenever there was a battle between the two, ISIS had the upper hand. And I think that the extreme right wing will have the upper hand in Israel, and I think they're going to push the conflict in Al-Quds towards a situation where things will explode. The situation in the region is not going well for the Israeli regime. Israel's source of strength comes from Europe and the United States, which are without a doubt declining powers. Every day that the war in Ukraine continues, Western power declines just a bit more, and that has consequences for the Israeli regime. And with a rapprochement that's going on between Iran and other countries in the Persian Gulf region, I think that draws more attention to the actions of this very extreme right-wing government in Israel. So the potential for a war in West Asia, I think, is just as high as in East Asia.
Sobering, and we'll come back to East Asia in a minute. Sticking to your neighborhood for a moment. Lots of good news, as you adumbrated, but all that good news is bad news for somebody else. And it's bad news for Israel, and it's bad news for the United States. Question, therefore, is, do they sit back and watch the landscape transform still further, and all that good news bedding in and becoming deeper, and more internationally significant vis-a-vis East Asia, vis-a-vis Eastern Europe, Russia, and so on, the BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, or do they try now, before it's too late in a way, to wreck or disrupt the process that's going on? That's the question I have in my mind.
The smart thing would be for them to recognize the new reality and to try to deal with it in a rational manner. But I don't think that is what the Americans are going to do. But then again, the Americans don't have great options because they are fighting a war in Europe, effectively, a war that is bringing down Europe in many ways. They are increasing tensions with China. I don't really think the Americans have the resources, the energy, and the will to get into a fight in the Persian Gulf region or in West Asia. So that will leave the Israeli regime very vulnerable. And if the Israelis do something very stupid, like bring down the Al-Aqsa Mosque, I think that anything could happen. And you will see those countries that establish relations with the Israeli regime break off ties. We'll see a huge amount of violence because there will be universal outrage across the region. Those countries that have relations with the Israelis would not want to be seen to be having anything to do with them. So, but then again, the new regime, the current regime in Tel Aviv, is extremely right wing, and I think that Netanyahu, regardless of how immoral he is, he's more or less a hostage of this very right wing faction because his fate is in their hands. If they dump him, he probably goes to jail. So these people are very ideological. They occupy, most of them are in the West Bank, and they are determined to have their way. And they're not politically correct like the liberals. They're very clear and open about what they want to do to the Palestinian people and to Beit al-Muqaddas. So or the Al-Aqsa Mosque. So we'll have to see. But again, I don't see how the region can escape war. When will that war happen? I don't know. But for at the moment, I feel that the war, instead of being in the Persian Gulf, because earlier I would have said that the chances for war in the Persian Gulf were higher. But now I don't believe that anything in the Persian Gulf, anything bad will happen in the Persian Gulf because everyone is moving towards a new relationship and a rebuilding of relations in the eastern part of West Asia. But I think now we have to keep an eye on the Mediterranean.
Now, as you know, I've been involved, perhaps too involved, in this part of the world for more than 50 years. I have been in the Palestinian issue very, very closely indeed. And I have never known a time, and never imagined that a time would come when, short of nuclear war, Israel is outgunned now. The balance of military power has shifted decisively. Israel could be struck by missiles, increasingly powerful and sophisticated missiles, from half a dozen angles, maybe a dozen angles, from Yemen, from Iraq, from Syria, from Lebanon, from Gaza, leaving aside any direct involvement from the Islamic Republic of Iran. Israel cannot actually defend itself from missile attacks of hundreds, maybe thousands of missiles raining down upon it. So short of what you might call the Samson option of destroying everybody and the whole region in a nuclear cloud, the balance of military power has shifted very, very decisively, begging the question, why would Netanyahu and his gang want to risk war in those circumstances?
You're absolutely correct. Not, for example, in Lebanon, the resistance or Hezbollah, their assets are all underground. They're inaccessible to the Israelis. The Israeli regime, their only strong point is their air force. And I'm pretty sure that not only are Hezbollah assets well protected underground, but I'm pretty sure they also have the ability to bring down those planes when the time comes. And probably the same is true in Syria as well. So the Israelis are not only vulnerable from Lebanon and Syria and Jordan and Gaza, but also their assets in the Mediterranean Sea are vulnerable, and as you pointed out, in the Red Sea too. So they are in no position to fight a war. But the problem, I think, is that the Netanyahu is trying to stay out of jail, and therefore he has to go down the road that the extreme right wing, his extreme right wing allies, have paved for him. And these people have their ideology is basically pushing them in this direction. So I don't think that they're looking at the battleground or the potential battleground, as they say, in an objective manner. They're looking at it from a very emotional perspective. And I think there's also an element of exceptionalism too. Just like the United States, when the people have an exceptionalist ideology, I think it prevents them from seeing things as they are. They see themselves as invincible somehow. And that's one reason why I think the American government is in such a bad state, because administration after administration, they've been making decisions in this bubble in Washington. They see themselves, or at least they want to see themselves, as invincible. So they keep making foolish and stupid mistakes, which further diminish their power. But they can't see what they're doing to themselves, because they look at the world through that exceptionalist ideological perspective. And the Israeli regime, their ideology of exceptionalism and supremacism, I think makes them wish to see their potential adversaries as incapable and backward and so on. So I think it's a combination of these two things, both that exceptionalist worldview, but also the fact that the internal struggle in Israel has particular characteristics today that we've never seen before.
True. Finally, Professor, China has a long track record of support for Palestinian rights, as indeed has Russia and the Soviet Union before it. And China has expressed through the foreign minister in the last couple of days that the need for meaningful negotiations, not the farce that we've been treated to for the last 30 years or more, but meaningful negotiations, might be something that they might be interested in brokering in the wake of the tremendous success that China has had in such things over just the last few weeks and months. Do you think there's any possibility of that? You think that has legs?
Well, if you mean between the Palestinians and the Israeli regime, I don't really think so. I think that since Oslo, those of us who are always very skeptical about Israeli intentions, we've seen how the Israelis were colonizing the West Bank in a way in which a two-state solution would be impossible. And I say that even though I don't even accept a two-state solution, because I think that an apartheid regime is an apartheid regime, whether there's a two-state solution or not. The right of return, Palestinians having equal rights, all of that has to be a part of the whole of Palestine. But that aside, the Israelis from the very beginning never intended to allow for a real two-state solution. They were buying time. And the way in which they've colonized the West Bank, especially with these extremists, these very right-wing people, leaves really no space for a two-state solution. These settlers, these colonizers that have basically come from Europe and Western countries, they're not going to leave. And no one in the Israeli political establishment is ever going to be able to remove them. So that's why I think that we are moving in a direction where the Israelis are ultimately going to lead their country, their regime, towards war, and it will probably be a very devastating war. I don't necessarily believe that the war will bring an end to the regime, but I think that it will diminish it significantly, and I think that will probably cause many Israelis to leave and many others to reconsider the whole Zionist project and the whole apartheid system. But again, I can't predict tomorrow, so I have no idea really what will happen in the future. But I don't see any hope for a peaceful settlement unless there are Israelis who are opposed to apartheid. There are Israelis who oppose Israeli Jews who oppose Zionism and who believe in equal rights. But at the moment, they're a small minority. Unless somehow there's a sea change in Israeli public opinion, I think that we are heading for some sort of conflict somewhere down the road.